You want to know the truth about Corwin Vale? Fine, I'll tell you, but you have to understand something first. I knew him before he was a legend. I knew him when he was just a kid who couldn't say his own name out loud without his voice cracking. People hear the stories now. They hear about the Ridge. They hear about what he did at Kessler Drift, how he held a line that should have folded in 9 minutes and held it for 2 days instead. They picture some giant, broad shoulders, a jaw you could break a fist on, a voice like a war drum. That's not him. That was never him. The Corwin I knew was a boy who sat in the back row of the Academy lecture hall and stared at the floor like it owed him money. He had thin wrists, a bad habit of chewing the inside of his cheek, and when an instructor called on him, even for something easy, even for a date or a name, he'd freeze up so hard you could watch the color drain right out of his face. So no, he wasn't built for any of this. That's exactly what makes it worth telling. Let me set the scene for you, because if you don't see the place, none of it lands. The Academy sat on a moon called Halden's Rest. Don't let the name fool you. There was nothing restful about it. It was a cold rock orbiting a gas giant the color of a bruise, and that gas giant filled half the sky all day and all night, so you never really got darkness. You got this dim purple glow, all hours, leaking through the dome windows and turning everyone's skin a little gray. The air smelled like recycled metal, and the cheap mint they pumped into the vents to cover the recycled metal smell. You stopped noticing it after a week. Then you go home on leave and your own house would smell wrong because it didn't have that mint-and-iron tang. It rained inside the dome sometimes. Condensation, they called it. The engineers swore it was normal. We just called it the weep. You'd be walking the long corridor between the barracks and the mess, and a fat cold drop would land on the back of your neck from 40 meters up, and you'd flinch every single time even though it happened every single day. That was Halden's Rest, a place that was supposed to make soldiers out of teenagers. I was 17 when I got there. Corwin was 16. They'd let him in a year early on test scores, which, looking back, was both the best and the cruelest thing anyone ever did to him. The first time I really saw him, not just registered him as another body in a uniform, was the 3rd week, tactics class, instructor named Dren. Dren was old, hard, and crevish, which means he had that gray pebbled skin and those flat black eyes that don't blink the way ours do. The crevish had been fighting alongside humans for 2 generations by then, and most of them respected us well enough. Dren did not. Dren thought humans were a fad. He thought we were soft, loud, and lucky. He liked to prove it by humiliating us. That day he was running a scenario on the big tactical table, a glowing map of some asteroid corridor, little red and blue markers swarming around. He'd freeze the sim at a bad moment and point at a cadet and demand the next move. Right answer, he grunted and moved on. Wrong answer, he'd spend 3 minutes explaining exactly how stupid you were in front of 40 people. He pointed at Corwin. "Cadet Vale, the flank's collapsing. What do you do?" And Corwin just stopped. I was sitting 2 rows up and over, and I turned around because the silence got loud. You know how silence does. He had his eyes locked on that table. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hand was shaking just a little, just at the fingertips, resting on his knee. "Cadet Vale." Still nothing. You could feel the room start to enjoy it. That's the ugly part of being young. We were all scared all the time, so when somebody else got picked instead of us, there was this relief that curdled into cruelty real quick. Somebody snickered, then somebody else. Dren let it sit. He was good at that. He let the boy drown. Corwin started. His voice came out about half its size. I'd pull the. "Speak up, cadet. Are you commanding troops or apologizing to them?" More laughter. And Corwin shut his mouth, just closed it, looked back at the floor, gave up. Dren smiled, and a crevish smile is not a nice thing, and moved on. "Cadet Akafer, show him how a soldier speaks." I answered the question. I don't even remember what I said. Probably I said pull the flank back and re-anchor on the high ground, which is what you say to everything when you're 17 and don't know anything. Dren grunted and moved on. I'd survived. But here's the thing I noticed, and it stuck with me, and it's the whole reason this story exists. While Dren was talking, I glanced back at Corwin, and he wasn't sulking. He wasn't even embarrassed anymore, not really. He had his eyes back on that table, and his lips were moving silent, fast, and one finger was tracing a line across his own knee, tracing the move, the actual move. He knew the answer. He'd known it the whole time. He'd known it before I did. He just couldn't get it past the wall in his own throat. I didn't talk to him for another month. Why would I? At 17, you don't go befriend the kid the whole room laughs at. That's how you become the kid the whole room laughs at. But I kept watching him because I'm nosy, and because something about that silent answer bugged me like a splinter. I started noticing patterns. In the mess, he ate alone. Always the same corner table, back to the wall, facing the door. Most of us didn't think about where we sat. He did. He always sat where he could see everything and nothing could come up behind him. In drill, he was nothing special with a rifle, middle of the pack. But on the obstacle runs, the ones where you had to make decisions under a clock, which gap to take, which rope to trust, when to go and when to wait, he was always near the front. Quiet. Efficient. He never wasted a step. He'd stand still for half a second longer than everyone else at a fork, and then he'd just go, and his go was always the right one. And in the simulation pods, this is the part, in the pods, he was a different person. The pods were these immersion rigs where they'd drop you into a command scenario, and you'd run it solo, no audience, just you and a headset and a fake war. Most cadets hated them because they were exhausting. Corwin lived in them. He'd sign up for extra hours. He'd run the same scenario 8, 9, 10 times, trying different things. And his scores were quietly, impossibly good. I know because one of my friends ran logistics for the pod scheduling, and one night, half as a joke, I asked him where I ranked. He laughed at me. You're like 31st. Out of how many? Out of 210. I was kind of proud of that, honestly. Top 15%. Who's number one? He pulled it up, made a face. Weird, some 16-year-old. Vale Corwin never talks. His numbers don't even make sense. The instructors think the pod's glitching for him. Top of 210. The kid who couldn't answer a question out loud. I thought about that for a long time. Okay, I'll tell you how we actually became friends, because it matters later. It was the weep that did it. Late after light slow, I couldn't sleep. I went walking the long corridor, the cold one, the one with the 40-meter ceiling where the condensation gathered. And I found him there, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, a slate balanced on his knees, the purple glow from the dome window painting one side of his face. He had the slate set to a tactical map, not a class assignment, something he'd built himself, some imaginary engagement, all his own markers, his own forces. He didn't hear me at first. I watched him move pieces around with his finger, mouthing things, pausing, undoing, trying again. He was completely somewhere else, completely unafraid. The shaking hand from the lecture hall was steady as a surgeon's. Then a drop of the weep landed right on the back of his neck. He flinched, that full-body flinch we all did, and the slate clattered off his knees, and he saw me, and the whole thing happened in his face at once. The fear came rushing back in like water through a broken seal. He scrambled to grab the slate, to hide it, like I'd caught him doing something shameful. "It's good," I said. He froze. "The map, what you've got there, the way you've got the reserve held back behind the ridge instead of committing it, that's good. Most people would have thrown it in already." He stared at me, his mouth opened, closed. I sat down across from him on the cold floor, didn't crowd him, just sat. "I'm Daniel," I said. "I'm not great at this. 31st, last I checked. You're number one. I figured I'd come learn from the best instead of being annoyed about it. It took him a long time to answer, long enough that I started counting drops of the weep. I got to 4. Then he said, very quietly, not looking at me, "It's easier when nobody's listening." That was the most words I'd ever heard him string together, and it was the truest thing I ever heard him say. It's easier when nobody's listening. So that's how it started. Me and Corwin on the cold floor with the fake rain and the bruise-colored light, talking war the way other kids talked about music. Except, and this is important, it was never really me and him talking. It was me talking and him answering through the slate. I learned this fast. If I asked him a question to his face, he'd lock up. The wall would come down. But if I asked it about the map, if I pointed at the markers and said what happens here, he could answer. Fluid. Sharp. He'd take my dumb plans apart so gently I didn't even feel insulted, just educated. I figured out that the map was a kind of armor for him, a place where the words could come out because they were about something outside himself. The fear lived in the gap between him and other people. Put a problem in that gap, a real problem with stakes and shapes and moving parts, and the fear had something to grab onto, and it forgot to grab him. I didn't understand all that at 16 and 17. I just understood that my friend was a genius hiding inside a kid who couldn't talk, and that the academy was going to grind him into nothing because the academy only measured one thing: whether you could perform on command, out loud, in front of everyone. And Corwin couldn't. It got worse before it got better. It always does. Dren made him a project. I think Dren genuinely believed he was helping in that brutal, old soldier way where you think breaking somebody is the same as building them. He called on Corwin more and more. He'd stop a lecture and just wait, arms folded, that gray pebbled face giving nothing, while Corwin sat there strangling on a sentence. The other cadets stopped laughing eventually. That's almost worse. The laughter turned into this low, embarrassed pity, which Corwin could feel just as well as he'd felt the laughter, and which sat on him just as heavy. I started intervening. I'd answer questions that weren't aimed at me. Drew Dren's anger off Corwin and onto myself, which got me extra duties and a personal grudge from a crevish instructor who could hold one for decades. Worth it. We were friends by then. You do that for friends. But you can't shield somebody from the whole machine. The academy had a culling system. Twice a year they cut the bottom of the class. And the cuts weren't just based on the pods or the drill scores, they were based on instructor evaluations. Subjective ones, command presence, decisiveness, leadership bearing. You can guess how Dren scored Corwin on those. The mid-year cut came. Corwin's name was on the list. I remember the morning they posted it. The list went up on the board outside the mess, and there was always a crowd, and there was always somebody crying and somebody pretending not to. I found Corwin's name about a third of the way down the cut list, and my stomach dropped. I found him in the cold corridor, of course. Where else? He wasn't crying. He was just sitting, slate dark on his knees, staring at the dome window where the gas giant filled the sky. I sat down, didn't say anything for a while. "You knew the answers," I finally said. "Every one. You knew them before any of us. They're cutting the best tactician in the class because he can't perform on cue." He didn't say anything. "It's not fair," I said, which is a stupid, useless thing to say, and I knew it even then. He picked at a thread on his sleeve. The weep dripped somewhere down the corridor, echoing. "My father," he said. I waited. My father couldn't talk either. Not like this. He stuttered bad. People thought he was slow. He kept his eyes on the window. He wasn't slow. He was the smartest man I ever... He stopped. Swallowed. He drove a hauler, cargo runs. Smartest man I ever knew, and he drove a hauler because nobody would give him anything else, because the first thing anybody judged was the way the words came out. It was the most he'd ever told me about himself. I held still, scared that if I moved he'd stop. "He used to say the words aren't the thinking," Corwin said. He'd point at his head. He'd say, "The thinking's all up here, it's fine, it's fast, it's better than theirs. It's just the door's stuck. Don't let them tell you the room's empty just because the door's stuck." He went quiet. "The door's stuck," he said again, softer, like he was apologizing to his dead father for proving the world right. I didn't have anything wise to say. I was 17, so I said the only true thing I had. "The room's not empty," I said. "I've been in there. It's the best room in this whole academy, and I'm not gonna let them tell me it's empty just because some gray old bastard can't get the door open." He looked at me then, really looked. First time, I think, that he believed somebody actually saw the room and not the door. "Here's what I did, and I'm not telling you it was smart or allowed. I'm telling you it happened. There was a thing at the academy called the Crucible. Once a year, before final cuts were locked, there was an open command exercise, a big live simulation that the whole senior staff watched. It was theater mostly, a showcase. The cadets who'd already been marked safe got to run squads through a scripted battle and look impressive for the brass. Cadets on the cut list weren't allowed to participate. That was the whole point of being on the cut list. You were done. You sat in the gallery and watched the people who'd beaten you. But the Crucible had a flaw, and Corwin, of all people, had found it. He'd found it because he lived in the systems. He understood the pod architecture better than the people who maintained it. And he'd noticed that the Crucible's live simulation pulled command inputs from any registered command node in the building, not just the ones on the floor, including the practice pods, including the empty ones in the back nobody used. If somebody was sitting in one of those back pods, logged in under the right kind of observer credential, with the right kind of override, they couldn't take command. The system wouldn't let an unauthorized node take command of a squad. But they could whisper. The system allowed observer nodes to send tactical suggestions to active commanders, tiny text pings, recommendations. It was a teaching feature, instructors used it, and the floor commanders, in the heat of a hard sim, with the brass watching, tended to act on any suggestion that came through their feed because they assumed it came from staff. Corwin had figured all this out. He told me about it the way he told me everything, as a problem on a map, abstract, harmless. He didn't even seem to realize what he was holding. I realized. "You could run the whole Crucible," I said. "From the back room. You could run somebody's whole squad through the pings and nobody would know it was you." He shook his head fast. No, that's cheating, that's. "It's not cheating if it's your plan and somebody else just types it in. That's called command, Corwin. That's the whole job. The general doesn't fire the rifle." "I'm not allowed to." "You're not allowed because they decided the room's empty," I said. "Let's show them the room." He chewed the inside of his cheek. The weep dripped. The purple light sat on us. "Whose squad?" he said finally, quiet, already calculating, the door cracking open. "Mine," I said. "I'm on the floor, I'm safe in the cut. I'll run a squad and I'll do exactly what you ping me exactly when you ping me. You command, I'm just the door." He stared at the dark slate for a long, long time. "They'll know it wasn't me," I said. "When it's over, we'll tell them. We tell them whose plan it really was. That's the point. The point is they see what you can do before they throw you away." A drop of the weep landed on his knee. "Okay," he said. "The Crucible day. I won't forget it as long as I live." The arena was the big sim hall, the one with the elevated gallery where the senior staff sat in their grays and blacks. The commandant herself was there, Veska, a human, hard as a frozen rope, who'd actually fought in the Tessin corridor back when the war was hot. Dren was up there. A dozen others. And the whole senior class crammed into the standing area, and the cut-list kids in the cheap seats at the back, where Corwin was supposed to be. He wasn't. He was 3 rooms away, in a dead practice pod, logged in under a borrowed observer credential. With the door stuck shut behind him, and the only thing in his ears the hum of the rig, and the only thing in front of his eyes the same tactical map he'd lived inside his whole life. Alone. Nobody listening. It's easier when nobody's listening. I was on the floor with a command rig and a squad of 12 simulated troopers, and a heart going like a hammer. The scenario they loaded was a defense problem. A relay station on a fractured moon, 3 approach corridors, an enemy force pushing in waves. It was designed to be lost slowly and gracefully. You weren't supposed to win, you were supposed to look good losing, hold long enough to look brave, fold at the scripted moment so the brass could nod and say good effort. The floor commanders started moving, the squad spread out. The first enemy wave came in and the gallery leaned forward. And in my feed, a ping came up. 3 words. Don't spread, pull. Everybody else was spreading out to cover all 3 corridors. Textbook. What you'd say if you were 17 and didn't know anything. What I'd have said. I pulled my squad in, tight, abandoned 2 of the 3 corridors entirely and stacked everything on the center one. It looked insane. It looked like I'd panicked. On the gallery I saw Dren's head tilt, that gray contempt. See, this is the kind of cadet we cut. The first wave hit. The 2 abandoned corridors filled with enemy markers, pouring in, and for about 10 seconds I looked like the worst commander in the history of the academy. Then the enemy in those 2 corridors funneled, because that's what corridors do, they funnel, and they all converged on the same choke point behind the relay, all bunched up, all stacked, exactly where Corwin had known they'd go, because he'd run this kind of problem 10,000 times in the dark. A ping. Now the reserve, the choke point, all of it. I threw everything I had into the choke point. The bunched-up enemy, packed shoulder to shoulder in that narrow space, had nowhere to go. We cut through them like the weep through the ceiling. The center corridor, the one I'd stacked, held against the frontal wave because it was the only place I'd put any defense, and I'd put all of it there. 2 waves gone, my squad nearly intact. On the gallery, the leaning forward changed. The quality of it changed. They weren't watching a kid look good losing anymore. I'm not going to walk you through all of it. We'd be here all night. But I'll tell you it kept going like that, wave after wave, and every time the situation got worse, the pings got calmer, shorter, surer. The other floor commanders, the safe ones, the ones with command presence and leadership bearing, they were doing the scripted thing, the textbook thing, and they were folding right on schedule. One by one, their squads got overrun and they sat back from their rigs with that hollow look. And my squad just held. Then it did more than hold. A ping their command node, far left, the slow one. I didn't even understand it at first, but I'd promised. Exactly what he pinged, exactly when. I peeled 4 troopers off the line and sent them on a long, ugly, exposed run around the far left flank, through ground that looked suicidal, while the gallery murmured. There was an enemy command node back there, a control unit, lightly defended because nobody was supposed to have the troops to spare to go after it. Corwin had found it by watching the enemy's movement timing. The slow one, he'd called it. He'd noticed one cluster of enemy markers reacting a half-second behind the others, and from that half-second he'd deduced where the brain was. My 4 troopers reached it, took it, and the entire enemy force, suddenly headless, lost coordination. The script that ran them assumed the player would never get there, so when the node fell, the whole attack stuttered and broke. The sim ended. The relay station stood. My squad, battered, 12 down to 7, stood on top of it. I had won the unwinnable scenario, the one designed to be lost. The sim hall went absolutely silent. Even the weep, I swear, even the weep held its breath. Commandant Veska stood up in the gallery. "Cadet Akafer," she said, and her voice carried the way only a real soldier's does. "Stand." I stood, my legs were water. Explain what I just watched. And here it was, the moment, the whole reason for the plan. I was going to tell her. I was going to point at the back rooms and say it wasn't me, it was never me. The best tactician in this academy is sitting alone in a dead pod 3 rooms away because you decided the room was empty. But before I could open my mouth, Dren was on his feet. Commandant, this is a deception. His flat black eyes swept the floor. No cadet improvises like that. He had help, outside input, check his command feed. The murmur turned ugly. And I understood, with a cold drop down my spine worse than any weep, that this was going to go wrong. They weren't going to hear best tactician in the academy. They were going to hear cheating. They were going to throw us both out, and Corwin's name would go on a list that said not just unfit but dishonest, and the door would never, ever open again. I opened my mouth to take the whole blame myself. To say I'd rigged it alone, my fault, leave the other kid out of it. And that's when the doors at the back of the hall opened. And Corwin walked in. He'd heard it, of course he had. He'd been logged into the building systems. He had Veska's challenge in his ears the second she said my name. He could have stayed in the dark pod, stayed safe. Let me take the fall. Stayed the boy who couldn't talk. He didn't. He walked the length of that silent hall, every senior staff member, every cadet, the commandant, Dren, all of them turning to watch this thin 16-year-old with the bad wrists cross the floor. And I watched the fear coming up in him like the tide. I watched his hands start to shake. And I thought, he's not going to be able to do it. He's going to lock up in front of all of them, and it'll be the lecture hall all over again, but 1,000 times worse. He stopped in the center of the floor, right under the gallery. Veska looked down at him. Dren looked down at him, already smiling that crevish smile. Cadet, Veska said, "Who are you?" Corwin's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The wall, the stuck door. I felt it from across the room. The silence stretched and the pity started gathering at the edges of it, the same low, cruel pity from the lecture hall, and I wanted to die for him. Then Corwin did something I'll remember until I'm dust. He didn't try to introduce himself. He didn't try to explain himself. He couldn't, the door was stuck on that, it would always be stuck on that. Who are you was a question about him, and the fear had its hand around that question. Instead, he turned to the big tactical display still glowing with the finished battle. He pointed at it, and he started talking about the map. The scenario's built to be lost, he said, and his voice came out clear, quiet but clear, because it wasn't about him anymore. It was about the problem the armor was on. It's built to be lost because it assumes the commander defends all 3 corridors. That's the trap. 3 corridors, 1 squad, you can't hold 3 with 12. So everyone splits and everyone loses on schedule. You could have heard a pin drop. You could have heard the weep 40 meters up. So you don't hold 3, you hold 1, you give them the other 2, because corridors funnel and a funnel is a kill box if you have the discipline to wait for it. Everyone's taught not to give up ground. That's the second trap. The ground isn't the point. The enemy's the point. You give them the ground, you take the enemy. He pointed at the far left. And the node's back here. You can see it because one cluster runs half a second slow. Half a second is a tell. Half a second is the difference between a force and a brain pretending to be a force. You take the brain, the force is just bodies. He stopped. The fear came back into his face all at once, like he just remembered there were people watching. His hand started shaking again. He shoved it in his pocket. And in the silence, very quietly, almost to himself, he added, "Cadet Okafor ran it perfectly. He just did what I told him. It was my plan. If somebody has to be cut for cheating, cut me. He was the door, I was the room." He had no idea what those last words sounded like to anyone but me. But I knew. The room. The best room in the academy. He just opened the door himself in front of everyone and let them all look inside. Dren started to say something about the rules, about unauthorized access. He was right, technically. Corwin had broken about 6 regulations to do what he'd done. Commandant Veska held up one hand and Dren stopped. She came down from the gallery, slow. She walked across the floor to where Corwin stood with his shaking hand jammed in his pocket and his eyes on the ground. And she stopped in front of him, close, and she looked at him for a long time. Veska had fought in the Tessin corridor. She'd held a real line on a real moon while real friends died around her. She knew what it cost. She knew the difference between command presence and command. "Look at me, Cadet," she said. He couldn't. "That's all right," she said, softer than I'd ever heard her. "You don't have to look at me, look at the map. Tell me one more thing about the map." And something passed over his face, relief, almost, that someone had understood the trick of it, that someone had handed him the armor instead of demanding he stand there naked. He looked at the map. "At the end," he said, "I had 7 left. I could have spent them holding the relay and called it a win, but I sent 4 after the node. Because a win where you're dug in waiting for the next wave isn't a win, it's a slower loss. You don't survive a siege by surviving, you survive it by ending it." He paused. "My father used to say, don't outlast the thing, end the thing." His father, who drove a hauler because nobody would open the door. Veska was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to the gallery, to all of them, to Dren. "This cadet's name was on the cut list," she said. "It wasn't a question. She'd already checked, or she just knew. Take it off." Dren started to object. "Commandant, his evaluations, his command presence is—" "I don't care if he never says another word out loud as long as he lives," Veska said. And her voice went hard again, the frozen rope voice, the Tessin corridor voice. "I have buried men with beautiful command presence. I have buried the loud ones and the brave-looking ones and the ones who could give a speech that put fire in your chest. You know what I'd trade every one of those speeches for? One person who can look at a no-win problem and find the line through it. I just watched a 16-year-old find a line through a scenario I designed to have no line. So you will take his name off the list. And you will figure out how to teach a soldier who thinks faster than he can talk, because that, gentlemen, is a resource, and we are at war, and we do not throw away resources because they make us uncomfortable." Nobody said anything. The weep dripped somewhere far up in the dark. That's how it started. The legend everybody knows now, Kessler Drift, the ridge, all of it, it started on a cold, purple-lit floor with a thin kid pointing at a map because he couldn't bear to point at himself. They didn't fix him. I want to be clear about that because the stories make it sound like he had some breakthrough and became confident and charming and loud. He never did. To the day I last saw him, Corwin Vale could not make small talk to save his life, couldn't order food without rehearsing it, couldn't say his own name to a stranger without that little crack in his voice. But Veska kept her word. They figured out how to use him. They stopped making him perform and started letting him work. They built him a way to command that ran the way his mind ran, through maps, through systems, through the cool abstract space where the fear couldn't reach him. They gave him a feed and a display and people who'd learned to read his short, calm pings, and they pointed him at problems nobody else could solve. And he solved them. God, did he solve them. The shy kid who couldn't speak in class. Turned out the door being stuck never meant the room was empty. It just meant the rest of us had to learn how to listen for what was inside. So now you know how it started. Let me tell you how it became the thing they tell stories about. 6 years passed between the Crucible and Kessler Drift. I won't drag you through all of them. Most of war is waiting. Anyway, waiting and paperwork and bad coffee, and the kind of boredom that makes you almost wish for something to happen, until something happens and you spend the rest of your life wishing it hadn't. But I'll tell you the shape of those 6 years, because it matters. Corwin and I came up together. We made sure of it. Where one of us got posted, the other found a way to follow, and after a while the brass just stopped fighting it, because they'd figured out the same thing I'd figured out on that cold floor on Halden's Rest. Corwin Vale was the room, I was the door. He couldn't command troops the normal way, couldn't stand in front of a company and give the speech, Couldn't take a calm and bark orders into the noise. The fear never left him. It just learned to live in the spaces where people expected him to talk as himself. So they built a system around him, and I was the center of it. He'd sit in the command space with his maps and his feeds, calm as still water, and he'd send me the line through the chaos, and I'd say it out loud in the voice the soldiers needed to hear. People started calling me his voice. They weren't wrong, but a voice without a room behind it is just noise, and everybody knew where the room was. We got good. Then we got famous. In the small, ugly way you get famous in a war, by being the unit they sent when the situation was already lost, and they needed someone to lose it slowly enough for everyone else to get away. Corwin hated that, hated being the slow-loss unit. Don't outlast the thing, he'd ping me every single time, end the thing. And more often than anyone had a right to expect, we did. Now Kessler Drift. You have to understand what Kessler Drift was, or none of the rest makes sense. It wasn't a planet. It was a station, a massive orbital refinery hung in the gravity well of a dead star, processing the heavy elements they scraped out of the accretion disk. 500,000 people lived and worked on it. Civilians, mostly. Refinery crews and their families. The kind of people who'd never held a weapon and never wanted to. And it was the only fuel processing node for 9 systems, which meant whoever held Kessler Drift held the throat of the whole sector. The enemy, and I'll just call them the Conquered, because that's what they called themselves, the Conquered of Aligned Worlds, which is a very polite name for what they did. The Conquered wanted that throat. They'd been pushing toward it for a year, and the High Command, in their wisdom, had decided Kessler Drift was indefensible and started quietly planning the evacuation. The problem with evacuating 500,000 people from an orbital station is that it takes time, weeks, and ships, and the ships had to come from somewhere and they came slow, and the Conquered fleet was coming fast. The math was brutal. By every projection, the Conquered would arrive about 9 days before the evacuation could finish. 9 days where a half-finished evacuation meant a station full of civilians and a Conquered fleet that did not take prisoners. They needed someone to hold the drift for 9 days, with almost nothing, against almost everything. You can guess who they called. I remember the briefing. Small room, bad light, a hologram of the station turning slow in the middle of the table. The officer running it, a tired logistics colonel named Hain, laid it out flat, no sugar. We'd have 1 understrength defense battalion, some fixed station guns, half of them down for maintenance, a scattering of fighter craft, old ones, and the station itself, which was a refinery, not a fortress, full of pressurized fuel lines and civilians and 1,000 ways to die that had nothing to do with the enemy. Against us, a Conquered assault group, 3 capital ships, dropship capacity for a full ground division. They'd come in, crack the defenses, and take the station intact because they wanted the refinery, not the rubble. 9 days, Hain said. That's the number. You give us 9 days, we get the civilians out. You don't, we don't. He didn't say, and then you all die. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room could do the arithmetic. I looked at Corwin. He was at the end of the table where he always sat, back to the wall, facing the door. He had a slate. He hadn't said a word the whole briefing. Hain had been briefed about him, knew not to call on him, knew to just lay out the facts and let the room work. Corwin was looking at the turning hologram of the station, the way he'd looked at the lecture hall map all those years ago. That same somewhere else look. The fear nowhere on his face, because there was a problem in front of him and the problem ate the fear. His finger moved across the slate. A ping came up in my feed. 3 words. This is winnable. I almost laughed out loud. 3 capital ships and a division against an understrength battalion on a fuel station, and the shy kid was telling me it was winnable. I'd learned a long time ago not to bet against the room. "Colonel," I said, "we'll take it."